long before tiny homes were a trendy Pinterest board, and centuries before central heating spoiled us all with its invisible coziness. Early settlers faced a simple but pressing question. How do you survive winter in a place where the snow doesn't melt so much as linger ominously until May? For many, the answer lay not above the ground, but beneath it. Let us drift, quite slowly, back to the 1600s, where European settlers are arriving in North America, full of optimism, questionable maps, and painfully thin coats. Imagine stepping off a boat after weeks of salted meat and sea-churned stomachs, only to be greeted by trees, hills, and a wind that seems personally offended by your presence. The winters were cruel in this new world, not charming like a Dickens novel. Less roaring fire and hot toddy, and more snow has entered the bed again, and I can't feel my knees. The earliest New England colonists quickly realized that if they wanted to stay alive, they'd have to reimagine what home meant. Which brings us to the delightful subject of dirt, earth, soil, good old reliable mud. Many settlers turned to what were known as dugouts or sod houses, partial or fully subterranean structures ingeniously fashioned from whatever was at hand, logs, stones, and plenty of the insulating power of turf. These weren't fancy. You wouldn't find them in the better homes and garden section, but what they lacked in polish, they made up for in practical brilliance. Picture a home half buried in a hillside, like something a rustic hobbit might begrudgingly accept during a housing shortage. The roof might be made of timber and grass. The walls, packed earth, floors, optional. Though some settlers did their best to smooth out the ground with a bit of clay or pine branches. And, this is oddly charming, the sod roof would occasionally sprout flowers in the spring. A home with built-in daffodils. These homes were warm in the winter and cool in the summer, using the earth itself as insulation. Smart, cozy, only mildly alarming when a mole wandered in uninvited. Of course, living in the ground wasn't entirely without its quirks. Digging too deep might bring water seeping through the floor. Digging too shallow left you at the mercy of the frost. And somewhere in the middle, well, that's where the porridge never cooled and the cow kept trying to chew the roof. Sod houses were especially common in the Great Plains, where trees were rare and wind came in sharp, unsolicited bursts. But even back east, early cabins were often partially sunken into the ground to conserve scarce resources and better trap heat. Colonial governors once worried about settlers going native, a 17th century way of saying embracing too many useful ideas we hadn't thought of. So they were none too pleased when colonists started copying the indigenous practice of earth lodges. Native peoples, of course, had long mastered the art of winter, survival. Take the Mandan people, for instance, whose round earth lodges were engineering marvels. Built from logs and covered in earth, they could shelter dozens, with central hearths that bathed families in warmth as frost painted the outside in quiet silver. Some colonial accounts, written in a tone that can only be described as suspiciously impressed, recorded the comfort of these dwellings, noting how well they held heat and resisted the biting wind. It's worth noting that many of the Europeans first learned to build dugout shelters not by chance, but by watching and, frankly, getting schooled by indigenous neighbors who were experts in thriving through winters most Europeans would find emotionally punitive. Now, before you nod off entirely, spare a moment to picture one of these early homes on a cold December night. The fire flickers in the center of the room, sending lazy sparks drifting up through a smoke hole. The walls are quiet, insulated by thick layers of turf. Snow muffles the outer world like a well-placed quilt. And in a corner bed of pine and straw, someone finally stopped shivering. They've made it through another day. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, let's slowly leave that cozy little dugout behind, ever so quietly. When the winds came howling through the endless prairie grass, early settlers had two choices: hide or freeze. And while freezing had its own bleak simplicity, most pioneers, with their love for continued existence, chose the hiding option. Let's imagine the scene. The autumn sun has fallen asleep behind a horizon stitched with golden stalks of wheat. A sod house, or soddy, squats low against the ground, like a turtle retreating into its shell for warmth. It doesn't shimmer, it doesn't shine. Honestly, it looks like a partially buried loaf of very sad bread. But in the biting winds of a frontier winter, that loaf was life. To make one, you'd start by ploughing up the earth, not for growing, but for piling. Prairie sod, bound together with roots as if nature knew it would someday double as housing material, was cut into rectangles. Imagine slicing cake, only it's made of dirt and regrets, and stacking that cake into 4 vaguely house-shaped walls. No need for fancy construction crews or blueprints. This was architecture with a shovel and a prayer. A roof might be made of wooden beams if you were lucky, and then, charmingly, more sod. Yes, your roof was in fact the same substance as the ground around you. Occasionally, it would sprout grass in springtime, giving your home the appearance of being both a shelter and a very confused garden. The charm of a sod house was not in its aesthetics, of course. Soggies, as they were sometimes playfully called, less playfully after flooding, were marvels of accidental insulation. With walls a foot thick, made of the same earth they sat upon, a sod home stayed remarkably warm in winter and reasonably cool in summer. It was thermodynamics delivered without permission. But there was a price: the bugs. Oh yes, the humble soddy came not just with 4 walls and a roof, but also a free assortment of insects, beetles, spiders, and tiny unknown things with more legs than necessary. Folks got used to brushing crickets off their plates and politely asking centipedes not to snore. Smoke from the fireplace would linger, clinging to the earthen ceiling beams like gossip in a quiet town. It didn't go anywhere fast, because chimneys were often makeshift contraptions built out of barrels or clay. Sometimes, optimistically, a stovepipe stuck out the side wall like a small metallic flag of hope, an occasional fire hazard. And let us address the aroma. To us, in our modern cushioned lives, the phrase earthy scent conjures up scented candles or expensive tea shops. But in a sod house, earthy meant quite literally earth. Wet, lumpy, crowded with microbes earth. Early explorers described the smell as somewhere between muddy boots and regretful compost. Still, those same explorers lasted approximately 0.3 winters without shelter. So let's respect the house of dirt, shall we? Wild winters blew like freight trains through the flat American plains, but a good soddy would shrug them off, stable and snug. Pioneers wrapped themselves in quilts thick as mattresses, tucked children into box beds, and listened to the muffled protests of the wind outside. Inside, the walls held their silence and secrets, absorbing the cold like a librarian absorbs gossip, quietly and with great focus. And those who had no time for sod cutting might dig themselves directly into hillsides, earth lodges, or dugouts. Now these were even cozier. Imagine a hobbit home under budget cuts, carved directly into a slope. The ceilings could be low enough to encourage poor posture, and the doors might be blankets nailed awkwardly to a frame. But warmth. Oh, the warmth was divine. The earth hugged back. With no trees in sight and no money in pockets, early settlers leaned heavily on what the land gave them. Mostly dirt and possibility, and perhaps some prairie dogs who seemed mildly offended someone had moved in. Now, as we nestle deeper into the terrain of these delightfully muddy homes, we begin to see that living somewhat underground was more than a survival tactic. It was cozy minimalism at its muddiest. Tomorrow, we'll wander even farther from the comforts of hearth and quilt to a winter shelter that walks the line between snow fort and survival miracle. On the frostbitten plains of the New World, the concept of housewarming took on a remarkably literal meaning. Forget scented candles and awkward potlucks. For many settlers, warming a house meant building one with the kind of ambition that whispered, "Let's disappear into the earth and live like agreeable moles." Because if winter was going to hurl knives made of wind at them, early settlers would simply vanish underground, out of politeness, if nothing else. Enter the dugout. Not the kind you're thinking of from baseball, although there was probably just as much spit involved. This was architecture for the shiveringly committed. Homes scooped out of hillsides, riverbanks, and any vaguely vertical dirt formation that looked like it wouldn't retaliate. Imagine it. A family of 5 arriving at the edge of a wide, whispering prairie, greeted by 20 square miles of grass and 0 pre-installed insulation. With no trees nearby, and certainly no Home Depot, their best option was to quite literally dig in. A modest shelter could be gouged from a slope, the roof made from whatever wood they could smuggle in on a wagon or bribe from sympathetic beavers. The walls, earth-packed, cold-proof, and dragon-proof, too, if dragons had ever made it to Kansas. Which, mercifully, they did not. These earthy enclaves were cool in the summer and comfortingly claustrophobic in the winter. Temperature regulation, impeccable. Natural lighting, non-existent. And structural integrity, let's call it selectively reliable. Rain was something of a complicated friend, excellent for crops, unfortunate for the living room. Many settlers learned the hard way that the key to a successful dugout was waterproofing, which was a mild inconvenience considering that waterproofing hadn't exactly been invented yet, nor had anyone the time to discover it in between surviving. So instead, they leaned into resourcefulness with a reckless artistic flair. Walls were tamped with clay, roofs lined with buffalo hides, and any available gaps were stuffed with straw, mud, or occasionally leftover optimism. Despite their rudimentary appearance, think giant hobbit hole on a tight budget, dugouts offered a kind of paradoxical luxury. They were warm, windproof, and crucially, cheap. Throws new meaning onto the term underground housing market. And inside, despite the earthy surroundings, settlers made efforts to create something approaching coziness. Quilts were hung where wallpaper might have been. Shelves were carved straight into the earth, and tin lanterns sputtered bravely, lighting up rooms with a sort of flickering cheer that said, "We know this is technically a cave, but it's our cave." Let's not overlook the social benefits of subterranean living either. Families that slept in one room, on one floor, with walls made of literal dirt, tended to develop a certain closeness. Sure, privacy was a myth, and every creak sounded like doom made audible, but there was something beautifully communal about cooking, sleeping, and surviving in a single shared pocket of the planet. Guests weren't usually invited, but if they were brave enough to come, they often brought their own stools and stories. both highly valued currencies in those days. Of course, there were downsides to living underground, namely the occasional rat, snake, or confused badger who mistook your pantry for a welcome mat. But settlers were remarkably adaptable. Many learned the art of shooing wildlife with the practiced swiftness of a person who's externalized their internal screaming. And if you stayed long enough, even the groan of shifting earth above your head began to sound almost friendly. The dugout's greatest legacy, however, might be what it taught its inhabitants, that survival didn't have to feel like suffering, that warmth could be won with ingenuity, and that sometimes the best home was the one you carved with your own two hands and then slept under, with a dirt ceiling an inch from your scalp and a family member's foot probably lodged in your ribs. Yes, these humble dugouts may have lacked chandeliers, but they made up for it with charm, grit, and just the faintest aroma of moss. And just when it seemed these settlers had reached peak adaptation, someone somewhere looked around their earthy living room and thought, what if we added more earth? Thus began the age of sod homes, those grassy bunkers of Midwestern legend, where the walls quite literally grew while you slept. By the time winter curled its frosty fingers around the shoulders of settlers in the northern colonies, it wasn't just about endurance anymore. It was about engineering, the kind of quiet, scratch-built wizardry that meant the difference between a cozy night by the hearth and waking up with your blankets frozen to the wall. Nestled in snowdrifts and buried halfway in the ground, early settler homes didn't just look like hobbit houses from a budget-friendly Peter Jackson remake. They also functioned with surprising brilliance, contrary to what we might imagine from movies where everyone just shivers in wool cloaks blowing on their fingertips. A decent number of these pioneer homes were actually, well, warmish, mostly. You see, insulation wasn't invented in some high-tech lab by someone in a lab coat whispering to pink fiberglass. It was discovered the old-fashioned way, by trial, error, and the occasional frozen uncle. When a family built a home in the severe winters of, say, colonial New England, they weren't just throwing up timber walls and hoping for a mild season. They dug. Houses were sunk into the ground for warmth. Half cellar, half cottage, entirely practical. Earth, it turns out, is one of the greatest insulators nature offers. Cozy, right? At least until your teenage son insists on a bedroom with a window and invents the draft. These semi-subterranean homes, often called dugouts, weren't just Depression-era solutions or frontier desperation. They were, in many climates, the best available option for survival. The thick, earthen walls soaked up the day's minimal sun and radiated that precious heat through the long, candlelit evening. Some of these homes even had turf roofs. Yes, actual grass growing on the top. A roofing choice that's eco-friendly, camouflaged from invading redcoats, and suspiciously attractive to goats. Don't ask how many historical records include the phrase, "Billy chewed through the skylight." Inside, things were briskly efficient. Hearths weren't just places to warm your toes and sing psalms. They were the beating, smoky heart of the home. Fireplaces were wide-mouthed beasts, often big enough to roast a goat whole, or at least argue about trying. The family would cook, dry, sleep, and occasionally host an in-law within arm's reach of that fire. Walls were frequently chinked, a term that sounds vaguely impolite, but is entirely respectable, with gaps between logs filled in using a mix of clay, straw, and the wildly persistent optimism of survival. It worked, unless of course it rained hard, and you discovered your insulation now included surprise mudslides, windows, the fewer the better, Glass was rare, expensive, and honestly, the size of a small squirrel. Most windows were covered with animal hide or oil-soaked parchment, materials that allowed light in, but not heat out. A colonial two-pane beauty might have been saved for churches or government buildings, not your average snow-covered hovel with a compting privy. In particularly frigid regions, say the Dakotas during that awkward season, the indigenous people called, why did these settlers even come here? Homes would often lack full-fledged doors. Instead, they had quilts, furs, or other thick hangings pinned in place, flapping open only for emergencies or brief moments of bravado. The theory: if a door doesn't let the cold in, the cold might just stay confused and circle outside. Despite all this clever design, the daily battle against the cold required more than clever architecture. It took community ingenuity. Families often huddled together in communal beds, not for romance, mind you, but for a sort of human-powered central heating. An 18th century New England bed might have included mom, dad, 3 kids, 2 cousins, and a very understanding dog. Socks were more valuable than silverware in some households, and if you possessed a brick warmed by the hearth and then wrapped in cloth to sleep with, well, you were living in the lap of luxury, assuming the brick didn't crack and singe your foot at 2 a.m. These homes weren't just shelters, they were systems, heavily recycled systems. Nearly every item had multiple jobs. A chair was also a laundry rack. A shelf, that's your drying meat station and your bookshelf if you're litter 8, which many were surprisingly determined to be, even while wearing 3 pairs of mittens indoors. It is tempting to romanticize these harsh winters and clever homes as something quaint and plucky, like something out of a novel where everyone learns the value of hard work and porridge. And yes, there was porridge. So much porridge that one wonders if oatmeal fatigue was partially responsible for the invention of cinnamon. But within these buried bastions of winter resistance, there was an undeniable genius at play, quiet, practical, and entirely necessary. And so, as snow fell outside the half-hidden roof, and smoke curled lazily into a pewter sky, another bedtime was marked not by clocks, but by the crackle of embers and the sigh of old wood settling in the warmth. In our next twilight ramble, we'll take a gentle look at the clothes that kept the cold at bay, one poorly stitched mitten and moss-lined boot at a time. But no rush, the fire's still warm, and the wind outside is only humming lullabies against the wall. As snowbanks deepened and daylight thinned to a flickering candle stub on the edge of the horizon, early settlers turned to a most unglamorous yet gloriously dependable ally, the earth itself. When walls couldn't weather the wind's grievances and roofs complained through their creaks, some pioneering minds did the only logical thing. They shrugged, grabbed a shovel, and moved in with the dirt. Yes, welcome to the snug and slightly musty world of the sod house and his chilly cousin, the dugout. Picture this. It's the 1800s, somewhere out on the Great Plains. You've claimed your patch of government-promised land, which in theory is glorious, fertile, and free. But when you look around, the only thing abundantly available is wind and prairie grass, and perhaps one judgmental badger who's already taken up residence where you'd really prefer to plant a root cellar. There's no forest to speak of, just a horizon that won't stop long enough to give you so much as a beam or a brick. So what's a pragmatic homesteader to do? Well, if you can't build on it, you build in it. Dugouts were the underdogs of frontier architecture. No paint, no porch, no picket fence, just a hole in a hillside roofed with earth and optimism. There was often one door, Perhaps a single glass window if you'd splurged at the trading post, and a chimney pipe poking out like a metal straw from a soil smoothie. And yet, for their unflattering appearance and the sheer number of insects who also fancied subterranean living, these earthen shelters held one unbeatable advantage: constant, comforting temperature. While the bitter winds whipped across the prairies above, inside the dugout it remained relatively warm in winter and refreshingly cool in summer. It was a kind of ramshackle geothermal magic. Not that the settlers used such terminology. They simply called it not freezing to death. Now, of course, practicality often dances with absurdity, especially in history. Many early accounts describe the first time a settler realized their roof had quietly grown a thriving prairie garden. Indoors. One November afternoon, you might find yourself ducking to avoid a poky thistle sprouting from the ceiling, while a curious mouse of unknown lineage nibbled at your cornbread. Visitors, if they dared come, would sometimes need to be reassured. No, we're not buried alive, we just live horizontally. Still, the sod house, soddy for short, added a bit of glamour to this lifestyle. Instead of digging into the earth, settlers stacked layers of sod bricks, cut lovingly with a specialized plow, called a grasshopper, into walls. These bricks, essentially tightly woven chunks of grass and root-packed soil, had more architectural integrity than expected, and when dried, they held together with a surprising amount of poise, until, of course, the seasonal rains made them weep silently down the walls. Imagine lying in a soddy at night, the wind howling like an unpaid opera singer, your quilt wrapped tightly, and the muffled sound of earthworms traveling through your roof. There's a strange peace in that earthy darkness. You, a crackling fire, a faithful oil lamp, and a home that smells just faintly of compost and ambition. Children born in dugouts didn't always know they were poor. They just assumed everyone's ceiling occasionally drooled mud. They grew up strong, resourceful, and suspicious of wallpaper. Of course, other innovations appeared as the settlements grew. Stoves replaced open hearths. Real lumber appeared like a dream off the back of an eastbound wagon. But the dugout and the soddy lingered in memory and memoir, spoken of not with embarrassment, but affection. They were the earth's warmest hug, improvised shelters that turned the bitter unknown into something survivable. Not exactly glamorous, but comfort isn't always painted white with gingerbread trim. And so, beneath layers of snow and starlight, families curled up within their earthen homes, sleeping close, dreaming warm, lulled by the muffled heartbeats of the soil around them. Next, we'll drift toward the forests of Scandinavia, where winter met its match in smoke-blackened timber and half-buried hearths, and where roofs didn't shed snow, they wore it like a seasonal hat. When the cold wind began to hum its ice-laced tune across the rough ridges of the Great Plains, the early settlers didn't shake in their handmade boots. They dug, quite literally. They weren't just building homes, they were unbuilding the earth itself. And in this gentler part of history, we pause to visit the snug and often forgotten world of the dugout home. Now, while the term dugout might evoke gentle baseball banter or the cozy area under your cousin's porch where raccoons hold council, on the frontier it meant something entirely different. These were homes carved into hillsides, coulees, or flatter land, depending on what you were blessed or cursed with on your land claim. Not ideal if your property resembled the flatness of an over-ironed pancake. But as with many things in history, ingenuity thrives where options do not. Imagine this: You arrive on the Great Plains in the 1860s, lured westward by government promises and the chance to own 160 acres of windswept optimism. The problem is, there's no timber, not even enough for your proverbial toothpick. The prairie, while bountiful in sky, grass, and suspiciously large grasshoppers, has exactly 0 forests. So with your axe softly weeping from boredom, you pick up your shovel instead. Enter the humble dugout. Sometimes little more than an earthen box with a thatched roof and a door made from your wagon's floorboards. It was a shelter born of necessity and mud. And let's be honest, mostly mud. Some even had sod roofs, which dramatically increased your chances of a cow strolling across your ceiling. But despite their edible ceilings and occasional indoor wildlife, dugouts worked. Earth, you see, is an excellent insulator. While the January wind howled across the plains like a banshee with a hangover, down in the dugout it stayed comfortingly cool in summer and stubbornly above freezing in winter. Cozy in a raw, muddy footprint on your blanket kind of way. Descriptions from the time are fascinating, partly because they're all written with calm understatement, like the authors were trying not to jinx themselves. One homesteader recalled their first winter in a dugout as a bit close-quartered but pleasant company with the mice. Another just called theirs acceptable, which is pioneer speak for, we didn't freeze or get eaten by anything larger than a raccoon. Now, you might be picturing a picturesque pastoral hobbit hole. Let me gently adjust that. These were not especially roomy. In fact, a typical dugout might measure 10 feet by 12 feet. For a family of 4, and a dog, and sometimes a bit of snow, because these homes weren't always waterproof, so much as water cooperative. If rain wanted in, it negotiated terms with the rafters. Windows were minimal, if present at all, making lighting something of an eternal candle hunt. Settlers often burned buffalo, chips in their stoves, yes, those chips, as trees were still a rumor in most places. But this also gave the home a certain earthy scent. One visitor politely referred to it as a natural aroma. Another opted not to remove his hat the entire stay. One must admire the practicality. The roof might be made from sod, laid carefully over willow branches or whatever wood could be scavenged from distant riverbanks. Floors, earth, walls, earth, decor. Surprisingly little, maybe a calendar from 5 years ago, or an oil lamp that emitted more smoke than light. Yet if you asked the settlers, they'd often say they got by. And by got by, they meant they survived, told stories by the fire, checked each other for frostbite, and dreamed of a wooden house someday, with actual corners. The community, though, was real. In some areas, dugout neighborhoods formed, modest, grassy bumps across the land, filled with laughter, steaming soup, and the occasional confused prairie hen that wandered in through the roof. They carved out lives with gumption and a slightly worrying comfort with spiders. And while today we might plop into our memory foam beds and adjust the thermostat with a satisfied beep, those settlers curled into their beds of straw and wool, buried in the earth, warmed not just by dirt walls, but by the stubborn flame of survival. But not all early homes were carved straight from the earth. Some, full of ambition and a suspicious number of baked bricks, aimed higher, quite literally. For those who had access to clay, water, and a great deal of patience, a different kind of winter shelter began to rise. The adobe house, sun-dried and stoic under open skies. Even in the most biting winters, early settlers found a way not just to survive, but to sit by a hearth and smugly sip whatever passed for cocoa in their day. It wasn't really cocoa, of course. More likely, it was warm water with a hint of regret and the lingering memory of last autumn's apples. But they stayed warm, which was the important bit, and not by accident. The earth itself was their first great ally. To understand their ingenuity, picture a place where winter isn't some poetic snow globe fantasy, but rather a prolonged exercise in frostbite avoidance. In places like the Great Plains, for example, wind had no regard for human feelings or toes. So when the prairie wind howled like nature's angry whistle, settlers turned downward, into the ground, enter the sod house. Sod houses, or soddies, were essentially prairie-layered earth cocoons disguised as humble homes. Instead of logs, which were about as easy to find on the prairie as a good Wi-Fi signal, settlers used what was abundant: grass, soil, and a well-tempered sense of desperation. Building a sod house involved cutting dense bricks of root-packed earth with a device called a breaking plough, or, failing that, a very strong back and questionable life choices. These bricks were stacked, grass side down and upside down, mind you, to form walls that were thick, heavy, and marvelously draft-proof. A sod house didn't exactly win awards for beauty, but it was naturally insulated and wildly fire-resistant, which makes it a rare home that could survive both winter and unwise stove experiments. And when it came to fires, the fuel situation required some creative thinking as well. Wood, again, was a luxury item. So settlers burned dried animal dung, often politely referred to as buffalo chips, which sounds like a Midwestern snack, but is in fact what it smells like. Now, if you're wincing at the aroma, remember, cold adds a new level of forgiveness to the nose. Plus, the buffalo chips burned hot and long, giving warmth without depleting the already invisible timber supply. Families gathered around these makeshift hearths, wearing multiple layers, sipping on warm broth or hopeful tea, telling stories, or, if the wind was particularly aggressive, just listening to the sound of frozen ambition slapping against the window frame. Of course, window frame might be wishful thinking. In many sod houses, glass was also a rare extravagance. Often, oiled paper was used instead, stretched across wooden openings to allow in light, while keeping out that charming Arctic breeze. It worked. Mostly. At least in theory. Roofs were another adventurous feature. They were often made of more sod laid atop wooden supports, in which case your ceiling might sprout wildflowers in spring and the occasional beetle during breakfast. Heavy rains could cause sagging or collapse, of course, so families often added an extra prayer or two into daily routine, just in case ceiling nature decided to visit the living room. But despite the shortfalls, earth crumbling occasionally, the odd rodent roommate, mysterious thumps in the night that hopefully weren't snakes, soddies did an extraordinary job of trapping warmth and making winter bearable. Beneath all that soil, a kind of comfort bloomed. In a way, the early settler wasn't just building a house, they were growing it. The prairie had become the pantry, the roof, the walls, and quite possibly part of the family. Children were born on those sod floors and toddled across them, occasionally retrieving worms from the cracks, much to their mother's horror and the family dog's delight. Visitors, when they came, would sometimes marvel, either at the cleverness of it all, or at the fact that people lived inside what essentially looked like an ambitious mole project. But the sod house became a symbol of quiet toughness, of meeting nature with a raised eyebrow and a spade. And in all that earth, there was something humbling. Wind outside could scream and rattle, but inside was a fire and food scraped together with care, and the quiet pride that comes from making a home out of literally nothing but dirt and hope. Next, as winter pressed down and snowbanks rose like sleepy fortresses around these buried homes, settlers turned their minds to the rituals of survival: warmth, food, and perhaps most surprisingly, underground refrigeration. But we'll come to that quietly, when the snow blankets the prairie even deeper. As winter's hush settled over the prairie like a quilt stitched from snow and silence, early settlers turned their thoughts to one thing above all: not freezing to death. This simple goal, so noble and so frankly uncontroversial, gave rise to some of the most brilliantly rude little traps for the cold in the history of human improvisation. And few traps were quite as bold or as stubborn as the sod house. Ah, the soddy. Imagine, if you will, a house knit from the earth itself, not merely placed upon it, but grown from it, like a potato, but one you could live in. Though, as one pioneer quipped, living in a soddy left you with quite a few less than charming roommates, and most of them had 6 legs. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. When settlers arrived on the Great Plains in the 19th century, wide skies, scarce trees, and a wind so sharp it could shave your morals clean off, they found a land full of promise, and also full of nothing. Nothing, that is, except grass. Endlessly thick, wildly stubborn prairie grass, whose roots gripped the earth like it owed them rent. No trees for cabins, no problem. The early settlers eyed the ground beneath their boots and thought, why not? So they took sharp spades and began slicing the very prairie into bricks. Dense, earthy slabs, about 2 feet long and 4 inches thick. It was like cutting lasagna, but with roots, bugs, and an existential yearning for warmth. These sod bricks were then stacked into walls, layered carefully like loaves of heavy, wet bread. One atop another, sealed with the same mud and earth, the humble sod house began to take shape. Roofs were either made of more sod, yes, grass growing on your ceiling, or a patchwork of wooden beams scrounged from distant forests and perfectly notched by men who secretly longed to invent IKEA instructions. Now, were these cozy cocoons of dirt and grass beautiful? Let's say, only on the inside, assuming you had a good imagination. But were they warm? Ah, wonderfully so. The thick walls had a remarkable insulating power, sheltering families from the biting cold and shrieking winds. Sure, you might occasionally brush a worm off your pillow, or share your dinner with a passing ant who felt he'd found an open-air buffet. But in the game of survival versus comfort, these settlers knew which had to come first. Life inside a sod house had a certain scrappy charm. Early diaries speak of flickering lanterns, low voices telling stories through chilly nights, and the occasional ceiling collapse when the prairie rains got too personal. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid, literally. And then there was the smell, a theme, it must be said, in many pioneer memoirs. Fresh sod houses had an earthy perfume that lingered for weeks. Imagine wet hay, a lost sense of dignity, and a strong belief in the American dream, all lightly toasted and served in a single sniff. Still, many settlers claimed they grew fond of it, or perhaps they just surrendered. Critics, mostly those in the cities, with their brick homes and natural fireplaces and opinions, laughed at the prairie dwellers, but they hadn't seen what a sod house could do. In the dead of winter, when the wind howled like a banshee on salary and snowbanks piled high, the sod house stood its muddy ground, cozy as a hobbit's reading nook. Children played on floors softened by thick quilts and stray patches of grass that refused to quit. Mothers ladled out hot cornbread and thick stews, the aroma mingling with the earth like a love letter to survival. And fathers patched the ceiling with straight-faced determination, occasionally muttering, "At least it won't burn down." There was community here too. Neighboring families helped each other to turf their homes, swap stories, and shoo away livestock that got curious about the structural integrity of edible walls. Imagine inviting a friend over only to find out his cow had eaten your foyer. These things happened. Perhaps more astonishingly still, these homes lasted. Decades, in fact. And more than a few outlived the people who built them, standing lonely beneath the sky, while modern highways bypass them like forgotten temples of invention and mud-based engineering. The sod house, then, was more than just a shelter. It was a symbol of effort pressed into the soil, of imagination under pressure, and of the astonishing things people can do when comfort is optional but need is not. Eventually, those grassy dwellings would give way to log cabins, timber frame homes, and brick structures, each warmer, fancier, and less likely to host an entire ecosystem. But for now, under a frostbitten moon and a sky as wide as melancholy, a sod house waits quietly on the prairie. Inside, a fire crackles modestly. Children sleep beneath blankets sewn from old shirts. And the cold, momentarily bested, waits in silence outside, too polite or too confused to kick in the door. Of course, not every home was built out of grass. Some people burrowed into the sides of hills like they forgot humans weren't moles. But that's a tale best told as the ground rises to meet us, just a little closer next time. High up in the snowbound corners of the American colonies, where winter lingered like a moody guest refusing to leave, settlers turned to the most unlikely of inspirations for survival, the earth itself. Having come from places where chimneys were considered a basic right and walls weren't expected to cave in from damp moss growth, they now found themselves building homes not above the ground, but beneath it. Enter the delightful oddity known as the dugout. No, not the place where benchwarmers mutter about their contracts during baseball games, but a bare-bones miracle of frontier architecture. Picture, if you will, your new home. Half hut, half hole, fully freezing. But somehow, warmer than whatever else was available. Dugouts were, in essence, houses carved into hillsides or burrowed into riverbanks. Imagine choosing a place to live based on its resemblance to a well-behaved animal's den. A little nook in the hill, just deep enough to hold a weary pioneer and maybe half a cow. To build one, the process was deceptively simple. Find a slope. Dig. Keep digging. Line the walls with sod or logs if you were feeling fancy. Furnish it with whatever hadn't frozen to death in your ox-pulled wagon. Voila. You've got yourself a home with walls made of dirt and a ceiling that occasionally drops bugs on you while you sleep. But oh, the warmth. The earth, ever the uncelebrated hero, maintained a more predictable temperature than the blizzards overhead, offering settlers a crude but cozy protection against the elements. These shelters were not palatial. You couldn't exactly host a colonial dinner party without risking someone dropping their spoons straight into the mud floor. And ventilation, well, that was less a design feature and more of a gamble. If you carved a little chimney out of stones and stuck it through the roof, you had yourself a fireplace. If not, you had a smokehouse for humans. Settlers often emerged coughing, soot-faced, and mildly surprised to still be alive after using their hearth. And yet, these homes carried a certain humble charm. Candlelight danced across the rough earthen walls, casting shadows that made modest hand-hewn chairs seem noble, even stately. Children might huddle under worn woolen blankets while mothers stirred stews that tasted suspiciously of yesterday's stew and the one before that. Meat was scarce, seasoning scarcer, but warmth that was earthen, steady, and generously provided. In fact, these underground homes, variants of which cropped up beyond the colonies, from Scandinavian settlers in the Midwest to the wind-hardened plains of Kansas, were marvels of folk ingenuity. With few tools, fewer resources, and zero YouTube tutorials, settlers managed to build shelter that, while not exactly luxurious, had one tremendous perk. It didn't blow away every time winter sneezed. One woman in Nebraska recalled her family's dugout being so small that when their pig got loose inside, it was unclear who the house really belonged to. And yet, the family stayed warm. The pig did too. It was a communal lifestyle, if by communal one meant close enough to smell everyone's thoughts. Even more elegantly savage were the sod homes that grew like oversized moles out on the open prairie. You hadn't truly experienced architectural character until your house sprouted grass on the ceiling every spring. These homes, made of chunky rectangles of earth and roots, were simultaneously strange, beautiful, and deeply itchy. But for settlers, they were nothing short of life-saving. The great irony, of course, is that these buildings, so humble, so practical, have mostly returned to the earth that birthed them. Only in old photographs, diary sketches, and obscure county museum models can we see what once kept a family of 10 and their goats from turning into snowmen with heartbeats. But in the moment, tucked inside their earthen walls, hidden from howling winds and marauding icicles, settlers probably didn't care about historical immortality. They only cared that the fire hadn't gone out, that the roof still held, and that somehow, against all odds, their toes hadn't fallen off yet. As we drift a little deeper into the geology of comfort and the whisper of winter winds against root-packed walls, our next stop will pull us slightly further inland, to a place where insulation was so deeply personal, it came with a heartbeat and wandered off sometimes. As snow laces drifted quietly down on the frontier, early settlers found themselves engaged in a peculiar conversation with nature. It usually went something like, "You may freeze us, dear winter, but we refuse to freeze without a very clever and ideally insulated fight. Enter the humble sod house." To the unassuming eye, a sod house, or soddy, as the folks not yet frozen stiff called it, looked like a small hill that had ambitions of being a building. Cover it in grass, nestle it into the earth, and pray fiercely that the neighbor's cow doesn't mistake your living room roof for a snack. But what these low-slung, lumpy earthen marvels lacked in curb appeal, they more than made up for in thermal merriment. Unlike the polished mansions we know today, rich in drywall and allergic to moisture, the soddy was born from necessity and soil. Early prairie settlers, particularly in regions like the Great Plains, where trees were scarcer than a warm lemon tart in January, had no choice but to dig into the very ground beneath them and stack it into walls like earthy, lichen-draped bricks. Sod bricks, cut out in neat slabs, were the homeowner's currency, each a block of grassroot-tangled dirt, weighing about 50 pounds of stubborn survival, or, in prairie math, 1/5 of a winter's hope. Constructing a sod house wasn't exactly like building a sandcastle. It was muddier, more taxing, and involved significantly fewer cheerful children. Pioneer families would use a plough, typically a borrowed one, to carve long furrows out of thick prairie turf, slicing the sod into 2-foot lengths. These were then hoisted into place, stacked crisscross like earthen lasagna, and left to dry or freeze into position, whichever came first. Once completed, the soddy was cozy in a way noble enough to invite both admiration and sneezing. The insulation was unmatched for the era. Earth is a naturally patient material. It doesn't chase trends or temperature swings. So a properly built sod house could trap warmth all winter and stay reasonably cool in the heat of summer. The irony, of course, was that if you didn't sweep often, you couldn't always tell where the floor ended and the wall began. Inside, life revolved around the hearth, usually made of stone, clay, or a shared dream of someday having both. Chimneys were often stylishly askew, crafted from sticks and plastered in a mud-straw clay mixture, a sort of pioneer papier-mâché artistry. Smoke found its way out eventually, ideally via the chimney and not the family's only blanket. Rainstorms were met with a determined optimism. For you see, sod roofs had a mild tendency to sprout tiny wildflowers in spring and leak just enough in a storm to keep you guessing whether your soup was thickening or merely diluted. Critters were another consideration. What with the walls being made of actual ground, you didn't so much keep mice out. No, you invited them in for tea and strongly worded discussions about personal space. Snakes and insects, not so much guests as roommates who didn't bother with rent or decency. Still, despite these earthy quirks, families flourished. Children learned to read by candlelight in dirt-warmed rooms. Meals were cooked atop stoves that hissed and popped like minimally dangerous dragons. Quilts were layered high, and stories were told softer than the snow building up outside. And perhaps most charming of all, in a landscape of frozen wind and not much else, the soddy was an expression of gritty domestic poetry. It was an achievement built not from money or imported timber, but from the very terrain settlers walked upon each day. It gave them roots, quite literally, and warmed them through storms when nothing else could. From their low-built fortresses of frozen prairie mud and improbable optimism, pioneers looked out over fields of snow but only after making sure the roof wasn't bleeding raindrops into the stew, dreamed of spring. But not all winterproofing involved building from the ground up. Some settlers, keen observers of local wildlife, chose instead to head inward, deep beneath the surface, where warmth wasn't built, but burrowed. By the time November rolled itself hazily over the frost-bitten fields of the American frontier, everything began to resemble a still life painting in tones of grey and faded wheat. The trees stood bare like tired sentinels. The streams, once vocal and stubbornly optimistic, muttered beneath thin crusts of ice, and in the shallow dips of the landscape, little tufts of chimney smoke rose obediently from the earth, like whispers trying to escape their subterranean homes. Yes, we've reached the time and place to talk about one of my personal favourites of cold weather contraptions, the good old sod house, or soddy, if you're on familiar terms, which, by now, you are. Now, this deserves a little quiet amazement. The literal homes made out of dirt. Imagine being so committed to staying warm. You look at the ground and think, yes, that shall be my ceiling. To appreciate the sod house, you first must understand the prairie. A land so flat you can watch your dog run away for 3 days, with little timber available and the wind behaving like it had vengeance in its heart. Early settlers had to get innovatively horizontal. They turned to the ground itself, slicing up thick sheets of prairie grass and soil, like they were building a lasagna from the bottom of the earth. Each brick of sod weighed somewhere in the ballpark of 40 to 50 pounds, which made construction a full-body experience and an excellent substitute for both CrossFit and therapy. But the payoff? A snug, thermally miraculous little hobbit hole that held heat like a womb and stood strong against winter gusts that could skin the eyebrows off a buffalo. These homes were cozy in the way a root cellar is cozy, or a neatly insulated baked potato. The hero's thick, earthen walls held warmth in the winter and coolness in the summer, a little meteorological miracle that made them more efficient than some modern apartments with confusing heating settings. Inside, the aroma was a delightful blend of damp dirt, frontier courage, and whatever stew was keeping itself company on the stove. And while guests occasionally noted the charming tendency of prairie mice to skitter through the walls like fuzzy landlords, most folks agreed that a sod house was infinitely preferable to a tent, or nothing at all, and the acoustic qualities simply enchanting. The heavy sod muffled the howling wind like nature itself had placed a thick quilt over your ears. You could almost believe the blizzards had been demoted to background actors. Of course, there were quirks. During spring thaw, pieces of the ceiling might yield to gravity and politely plop into your soup. Rainstorms sometimes turned walls into mudslides. And then there was the ongoing partnership with insects, little tenants with no appreciation for rent agreements. But those were small sacrifices for the glorious splendor of not summoning frostbite with every exhale. Ladies dressed their interiors with embroidered curtains and newspaper wallpaper. Yes, actual newspaper. Because who doesn't want to learn about grain prices while brushing their hair? Some even managed to hang framed pictures on the sod walls, using wooden slats or occasionally just a well-aimed nail and an optimistic mood. And from these rooted havens, families played fiddle music into the night, read aloud by lamplight, and told stories passed down from their own rugged mothers and grandfathers who had dared the elements. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm. And in the frozen silence of winter, that was luxury enough. Even prairie poets, whose pens were often fueled by equal parts desperation and beans, wrote affectionately of the sod house. It isn't much to look at, they'd concede, but she keeps the wind out and the coffee hot. High praise indeed from people living inside very large dirt clods with ambitions. And that's the curious charm of the sod home. A house made of earth, by hands calloused from love and stubbornness, pressing life into the soil one brick at a time. But not everyone chose to go underground, or under grass, in this great architectural dance with winter. Some early settlers looked not at the ground, but toward an even more ephemeral building material. Wood. No, stone. Not quite. No, some brave souls built their winter dreams entirely out of snow. There is a certain romance in the idea of smoke curling from a chimney atop a snow-covered roof, the hearth aglow while the world outside succumbs to frostbite and fox tracks. But the chimney, as charming and Dickensian as it might appear, was once a rather dangerous contraption, especially in homes made partially or entirely of dirt. In the wilderness of the American Great Plains, or the frosty stretches of the Canadian frontier, settlers sawed down few trees, mostly because there were few trees to saw. Instead, they grew fond of sod. Yes, grass and earth, lovingly peeled from the earth like a tough lasagna noodle, stacked and packed into cozy little rectangles, and arranged into homes that looked like hobbits with a taste for dirt, but hearths made of sod. Not ideal. A flaming log and a wall of flammable soil tend not to be best friends. And if an improperly vented chimney, a stick chimney, often tightly woven from twigs and clay, began to belch smoke into the room, or decided to catch fire altogether, well, then the entire earthen home might begin to roast itself accidentally from the inside, like a confused cabbage roll. To combat this curse of chimney-induced immolation, some clever settlers invented what we might politely call alternative methods of warmth. One such method, and is delightfully contrary to every modern instinct, was to stop trying to let the smoke out entirely. Instead, they let it in. Homes across parts of Eurasia, from the Hungarian puszta to the Central Asian steppes, often employed the concept of a smoke-filled indoor environment as insulation. In a dwelling called a pit house, nestled like a giant molehill into the earth itself, the smoke from the fire was encouraged to linger. The roof would allow a subtle, polite exit of smoke, eventually, but not before it had warmed the low ceiling and thick mud walls. Residents breathed slower, cooked slower, aged slower perhaps, mostly from the lack of oxygen. But they were warm, and in January at -30, that's a small, sooty miracle. In some Alaskan native houses, where the dwellings were ingeniously half-buried under snowdrifts and built with driftwood and moss, smoke was a strategic guest. The kazgik, or communal men's house, and its female counterpart, the enna, were both designed with semi-underground layouts and fire pits at the center. Smoke vents up, yes, but much of the warmth was absorbed into the walls and retained for hours after the fire was out. These smoke-saving, insulation-maximizing tricks formed a sort of pre-modern radiant heat system, real estate built not for beauty, but for survival with flair. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, medieval Norwegians and Icelanders also flirted with fire in windowless, turf-covered longhouses that looked like cozy dragon backs curled in the snow. A single fire pit in the floor could warm an entire elongated interior, and though the smoke was meant to escape through a hole in the roof, in winter it rarely did so eagerly. It made its way out eventually, like a stubborn old cat that needs another nudge. In the meantime, everyone inside coughed a little less vigorously with each passing century, as respiratory resilience became an unrecorded but sizable part of their genetic inheritance. But perhaps the most delightfully strange fireplace workaround, one that feels like folklore but is absolutely real, was the Russian pechka. The pechka was a massive ceramic or stone stove, occupying an entire wall or corner of the wooden izba, Russia's traditional peasant cottage. What made the pechka sleep-friendly, however, was not just its toasty brick exterior, but the fact that these stoves were bunk-worthy. Built right into the mass of the stove was a flat ledge, a sort of human-sized baking tray, where the grandmother of the house would often sleep. If babushka wasn't on it, a sick child might be, or the family cat, or all three, ideally, in a snore and purr competition for warming rights. The oven absorbed fire heat for hours, even after the flames died out. Truly the ultimate cozy core, a heated bed in a world where winter could mutter threats through every chink in the log wall. Other hearths involved heating stones in the fire and burying them under bedding or floorboards. The wanted warmth stayed, the smoke took the hint, and no, insurance claims were needed. These primitive but oddly poetic systems kept entire families alive in climates where frostbite waited like a mischievous spectre at the window. And as the world shifted further into the industrial age, smoke would finally make a cleaner, more graceful exit. But in these buried, burned and bunked abodes, it remained a stubborn and smudgy companion, a breath of danger, sure, but also a cue to huddle closer. As the fire crackled low in some long-forgotten stove, its warmth still lingering in clay and heart, the homes buried in earth prepared for another night. And now, if you're comfortable, Let's just barely lift the wooden latch on another tale. A story where winter comfort came not from fire alone, but from something a little more hoofed. On a crisp morning somewhere in the sprawl of mid-18th century North America, a farmer named Elias McDougall crouched low beside a pile of rocks, muttering to himself like a man on a mission, or a man with particularly bad knees in biting cold. He wasn't praying or philosophizing. No, Elias was laying out designs for what he called his snug-as-a-mouse burrow. And it wasn't imagination or nonsense, despite what the neighbors whispered through frostbitten beards. Elias was a proponent of what we now call earth-bermed architecture, or, if you're someone who enjoys saying long things slowly, a method in which buildings are partially buried or surrounded by dirt for insulation. In Elias's far humbler terms, pile enough dirt round your hut, she'll keep the wind out and the heat in. That's a house blessed by the soil, that is. It sounds simple now, in the age of central heating and streaming Scandinavian fireplace videos. But for early settlers, battle-hardened by winters that froze livestock mid-moo, the idea of letting the earth do the heavy lifting was nothing short of genius. Cold air is a determined intruder, but dirt is a faithful bouncer. McDougall's home, sculpted snugly against a natural embankment, was both shelter and statement. Its rear wall vanished into a hill, like a shy mole retreating from conversation. The roof, made of hickory planks and sod, hosted a family of confused squirrels well into early spring. The front door was a bit of a liability, being at face level with the average snowdrift, but Elias took pride in solving that problem by mounting an open barrel sideways for an entrance. You had to crawl through it, but it kept the heat in and made thieves think twice. Inside, it was dark and deliciously warm. Unlike conventional cabins that rattled and wheezed in winter winds like arthritic bellows, Elias's burrow held its breath. The thick earthen walls maintained a steady temperature, an unspoken alliance between rock, root, and warmth. There were drawbacks, of course. The chimney draft was moody, mushrooms occasionally appeared indoors uninvited, and once, a hibernating badger refused to pay rent. But on most nights, Elias lay swaddled in his woven reindeer blanket, smiling smugly into the flicker of his fireplace. Elias wasn't the only settler to latch onto the idea of letting nature do the insulating. Across the sweeping plains of the Midwest, sod houses began popping up with earnest practicality. Immigrant farmers, many from Scandinavia, took one look at the treeless horizon and said, more or less, well, this'll take some creativity. Without timber to spare, they turned to the earth beneath their boots. Sod, thick slabs of grass-bound soil, became currency in the architecture of survival. Settlers would slice it like cake and layer it as walls, roofs, even shelves if the mood struck. From the outside, sod houses looked like homes that a polite landslide had gently rearranged into place. Yet inside, they were miraculously quiet, cozy spaces, with gentle acoustics that dulled wind and storm like a warm sock over the ear. And these homes weren't lifeless, mole hills. They were filled with music and laughter, the scent of stew and stubborn optimism. Children played on sod floors that sprouted occasional grass tufts in corners their mothers never approved of. Rain sometimes seeped in, soaking anything foolish enough to be near the north wall. But when neighbors visited, they always took off their boots and marveled, warmer than my wooden house and fewer ghosts. Preservation of warmth in these earthly abodes was about using what was everywhere but often overlooked. The settlers, though burdened with very little, became accidental students of thermodynamics. They knew something instinctively that engineers would later confirm with squiggly charts. Dirt holds heat, and cold is lazy. Make a house that hugs the ground, and it will hug you back. Despite being far humbler than the grand colonial manors of the eastern seaboard, with their high ceilings designed to make you cold and impressed simultaneously, these semi-subterranean homes were feats of frank survival. They were proof that sometimes burying a problem just a little is, in fact, a clever solution. And so, as twilight settled on another snowbound evening, with Elias McDougall knocking icicles off his barrel door and humming triumphantly to the stars, one couldn't help but admire how the humbler kind of genius often sleeps underground, comfortable, quiet, and smarter than it looks. Just beyond Elias's hill, however, a different philosophy of warmth was taking root, one involving stones, fire, and a particularly smoky stove design that left more than just your chimney gasping for air. Far beneath a crust of snow thick as a pie topping and only marginally less edible, early settlers in the northern prairies cracked the code to surviving winter. And no, it didn't involve 18 layers of wool socks or drinking boiling tea until you forgot what warmth felt like. No, the real trick was simpler, smarter, and far earthier. They buried their homes. Now don't worry, this isn't a ghost story, this is a design story. And the ghosts, if there were any, were probably too toasty to do much haunting anyway. These semi-subterranean homes, often called dugouts, soddies, or pit houses depending on the region, were not signs of defeat but architectural triumphs. When facing wind that could snap your mustache in half, this underground lifestyle started to look less eccentric and more enlightened. Let's wander to the Great Plains sometime in the 19th century. The air is dry, the winters are unreasonable, trees are a luxury reserved for letter writing and Abraham Lincoln's romantic imagination. So when settlers arrived, wide-eyed and chilled to the marrow, they needed to improvise with everything except wood, because, well, there wasn't any. The sod house was born, a dwelling literally made from the ground up. It began with a hole dug into the prairie soil, hopefully on a gently sloping hill to keep rainwater from turning breakfast into a boat ride. Then, ingenious hands stacked thick bricks of root-bound earth like chunky, greenish Legos. These were cut from the prairie, where grasses with roots deeper than most philosophical questions held the soil tight, like nature's mortar. A good sod brick was 2 feet long, a foot wide, and weighed roughly as much as a well-fed raccoon. Settlers would pry them up with spades, stack them into walls, and mutter gentle prayers that it wouldn't rain for an entire decade. The roof. That was where creativity got crunchy. Some settlers laid poles or willowy branches across the top, spread more sod over them, and called it a day unless their cow fell through it. Others got fancier, interlacing hay, reeds, or even canvas under the earthy frosting. It wasn't elegant, but elegance was not the priority. Being less dead than yesterday, that was the priority. And here's the best part. Underground, the temperature barely flinched, while the air above trembled at minus a lot. Inside a well-built dugout, you could hover cheerily around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than most modern office buildings managed in January. These homes didn't just protect from cold. They muffled sound, held in heat, and came with the rustic charm of earthen walls that sometimes sprouted mushrooms. Who needs framed art when your wall blooms seasonally? Of course, the designs varied across time and ethnicity. Scandinavian immigrants, for example, brought with them centuries of experience building earthen homes in climates that regularly tried to freeze the coffee inside your mug. They helped refine the craft, tweaking layouts for airflow, placing warming stones under the floor, sometimes even dividing the room with half walls to create warming nooks as cozy as a kitten in a teacup. Yet even with the insulation of 6 feet of pasture pressed against your walls and the occasional vole house guest, life in a buried home was not, without its hiccups. Rainstorms turned walls into oatmeal. Sunshine encouraged surprise house sprouts. And ventilation was, let's say, rustic. Chimneys, if you had one, did double duty as both smoke exit and oxygen entrance. In other cases, a cranky little window bore the solemn duty of keeping lungs in working order. But despite their limitations, the leaks, the insects, the aroma that could only be described as damp goat in a library, these homes were beloved. They were warm, they were achievable, and they reminded settlers of the old country, or of what you might politely describe as the better parts of a hobbit's real estate portfolio. And so, night after night, under sod ceilings and within walls that hummed with the breath of the earth itself, families played cards by candlelight, told long stories that wandered through generations, and thanked the cleverness that led them not to build up, but to build down. Because sometimes warmth doesn't come from stacking logs high or loading the fireplace. Sometimes it comes from knowing that the very world around you, with all its dirt and silence and stubborn grass roots, is wrapping you up for the night. Tomorrow, we'll step just slightly above ground, where highlanders with turf-roofed houses flirted with altitude, sheep, and a whole new approach to staying snug. It turns out, when you're living half-buried in a house made of dirt and ambition, companionship becomes more than just a luxury. It becomes a necessity. And in a marvelously practical twist of frontier life, the early settlers' most reliable winter companions weren't always fellow humans. In fact, quite frequently, their biggest source of warmth, comfort, and conversation, though admittedly a bit one-sided, had 4 legs, a tail, and an impressive ability to sleep standing up. Yes, we're talking about livestock, cows, goats, sheep, and the occasional overly enthusiastic chicken. Welcome to the snug, slightly fragrant world of interspecies cohabitation. You see, in the dead of winter, when the wind howled through the prairies like a homesick banshee and snow piled up like unpaid library fines, early settlers had 2 options: freeze stoically or get creative with body heat, and creative they got. Many sod houses and dugouts, those cozy semi-subterranean shelters we've already learned to admire, often included a small enclosure or lean-to in which animals would reside either adjacent to or directly under the family living space. That arrangement had a practical effect. The animals' warmth would rise and help heat the rooms above. This wasn't a romantic pastoral decision. No one sipped root coffee by a flickering lantern saying, "Why yes, Addison, let's invite Buttercup to sleep in the parlour." No, it was a decision born of desperate necessity and a deep refusal to be found frozen mid-toast. Imagine it. A blizzard rages outside, icy air creeping through every available crack in the wooden frame. Inside, the family huddles under quilts stuffed with yesterday's newsprint and today's feathers. The unmistakable scent of hay and cow breath wafting up through the floorboards like rural incense. The rhythmic chewing of cud, a metronome for the household lullaby. It was, arguably, terrible, but undeniably warm. In the American Midwest and Great Plains, this strategy was borrowed from the Old World, particularly Scandinavian and Alpine traditions, where people had long since mastered the art of architectural cow snuggling. Norwegian Stabber and Bavarian Alpine huts often kept the livestock on the lower floor, with the humans above, a sort of duplex arrangement based not on class, but on mass, specifically bovine body mass. Settlers adapted this quirk quickly. Prairie winters could be brutal, and warmth was not to be squandered. Even just a few degrees of added temperature from a small herd of sheep could make the difference between nightly frostbite and a reasonably cozy evening. Of course, this arrangement required a certain tolerance to the smells, the sounds, and occasionally the accidents. Children were sent on daily, nay hourly, expeditions to check on the livestock, armed with nothing more than a burlap bag of alfalfa and the weary look of someone who'd seen too much. A startled goat might bolt and leap into someone's lap mid-meal. Chickens occasionally wandered into dinner conversations with all the social awareness of a sugared-up toddler. Yet families adapted. They even grew fond of their olfactory-challenged roommates. Buttercup, Daisy, Henrietta the Wonder Hen. They were named, petted, and occasionally overfed with kitchen scraps, which led to some eerily intelligent pigs. One Ohio homesteader once wrote in her journal, "The cow is as dear to me as any kin. She wakes me with her breath and hums the most melodic tune of all things warm." Historians remain uncertain whether this was an earnest sentiment or the passage of someone who'd been snowed in for too many weeks with limited reading material. Still, it's hard not to admire the tenacity. In an age before thermostats and central heating, how clever it was to make warmth walk in on four legs. No one wanted to live with their animals during winter, but the alternative was far less charming and much colder. So the settlers built their homes like hearty layers of lasagna. People on top, animals below, with timber, sod, straw, and hope sandwiched in between. A multi-species survival strategy born from necessity, executed with grit, and yes, a bit of manure. And when spring finally came, and the animals were ushered back to their proper quarters and open pastures, the houses retained a faint scent of their winter tenants, a musky badge of honor, a lingering reminder that sometimes, to survive the cold, we must embrace the warmth of whatever lives beside us, even if it occasionally tries to chew our boots. Now, let's softly wander deeper into these earthy dwellings, where we'll meet the curious tools and ingenuity that turned frozen soil into fully functional kitchens. While the biting winds of colonial winters howled across the plains and forests, flinging snow like a toddler with no regard for housekeeping, some of the more architecturally creative settlers turned their minds to the art of insulation with dirt. Yes, dirt. Let's take a slow, sleepy wander into the comforting world of dugouts, or as they might have called them back then, makeshift miracles that didn't freeze our eyebrows off. To escape the frostbite-inducing wrath of early American winters, some homesteaders, especially across the Great Plains during the mid-1800s, embraced the earth itself as their co-conspirator in warmth. These homes weren't built on the land, they were built into the setin. A dugout was, quite literally, a hole in a hillside or excavation into flat terrain, reinforced with logs, stone, or whatever decided not to blow away that day. And while that description may not immediately inspire visions of lavish comfort, let's remember that in the dead of winter, being alive and indoors already gave you bragging rights. The basic technique went something like this. Find a hill, dig into the side of it, frame the inside with timber if you were lucky enough to have trees nearby, and if not, ignore architecture books and just push on anyway. A sod roof, essentially made of grass-covered dirt, would be layered on top with a delightful blend of pragmatism and sheer hope. Rain. Well, yes, the roof sometimes wept. But oddly, in the chilled heart of January, a leaking roof felt like a distant summer memory. Despite their humble ingredients, soil, wood, and a bit of courage, these homes performed brilliantly against the cold. The earth acted like a thick woolen coat, keeping temperatures inside more stable than the weather outside. If it was 20 degrees with shrieking, when beyond the door, the dugout might hold firm around a snoozable 45. Not toasty by modern standards, but enough to preserve your nose throughout the night. Inside, the ambience could be generously described as eclectic colonial bunker. Walls were often smooth-packed clay or sod, sometimes whitewashed for brightness, though more often they matched the fashion-forward hue of whatever color mud you had. Fireplaces were rare, as they required stone and mortar, but settlers got clever, installing simple clay stoves, or in richer cases, iron ones, operated with logs they either chopped or politely borrowed from their neighbor without asking. Now, lest you imagine a humble hobbit charm here, know that dugouts had their drawbacks. Rain would sometimes seep in through the walls, and unless you'd thought ahead with a drainage trench, you were going to enjoy some cozy puddle time. Insects also found these homes delightful, especially the kind with many legs and poor manners, and as one settler described it in his journal, "The ceiling fell on me thrice, but I was not deterred." That's either perseverance or ominous foreshadowing, but still, there was something innately comforting about living inside the belly of the earth. These homes didn't just shelter bodies, they preserved spirits. In the dead of winter, with wolves howling in the distance and snow muting every outside sound, a dugout wrapped its residents like a slow-cooked stew, simmering safety into their bones. Children slept in bundled corners, their breath rising in fine puffs of cloud. Candles flickered softly against the earthen walls, casting shadows that danced like long-forgotten fairy tales. A single pot on the stove might hold beans, or more beans, or sometimes, just for flair, beans with bacon. The air, though dense with roots and dirt, smelled warm and real, and perhaps most poetic of all, many dugouts were reused in the spring as root cellars, because in the settlers' endless quest for practicality, nothing said multi-purpose like a home that could store potatoes and shelter toddlers in equal measure. Eventually, as timber became more available and dreams grew taller than hillsides, many families moved out of their earthen cradles into houses built above ground. The dugouts were left behind to return to their earlier careers as perfectly ordinary holes. But their whisper remains, of resourceful people who, when faced with wind as sharp as knives and winters as long as novels, quite literally buried themselves for warmth. Now, as that memory settles like soft moss over your thoughts, let's tiptoe forward into another ingenious chapter. One where the line between homestead and hibernation became delightfully blurred. Out on the open plains, a chill would rise from the earth like an old ghost with a cold handshake. Early settlers, staring into a horizon so flat it made pancakes jealous, knew that winter out here wasn't just a season. It was a personality. Blunt, moody, and entirely unsympathetic to your opinion on thermal socks. And so it was, amid these wide stubbled fields and creaky wind, that earth homes found their time to shine, or rather, to stay entirely unshiny, muted beneath a blanket of sod. These sod structures, affectionately called soddies, were less like houses and more like very determined gardening accidents. Picture this. No trees in sight for lumber, a wind strong enough to straighten your eyebrows, and snow that didn't just fall, but flung itself sideways like an energetic raccoon. The answer, as it turns out, was literally underfoot. Sod, that glorious blend of roots, soil, and slightly annoyed beetles, became the material of choice. Settlers would carefully cut thick strips of it, like earthy lasagna noodles, and stack them high to form solid, if slightly crumbly, walls. The roofs, more sod. Certainly not ideal for rain collection, unless you're hoping to surprise guests with a drop of cold mud in their tea, which, to be fair, may have occasionally added flavour. But these unpretentious heaps of greenery were marvels of thermal logic. Buried like rabbits, the settlers tapped into nature's old trick, insulation by encapsulation. Sod homes held heat as stubbornly as a grandparent withholding a recipe. In a world where every degree above freezing felt like a festival, that mattered a great deal. Inside, things were cozy, dimly lit by oil lamps, which bravely battled the scent of earth and the lingering possibility of rodents with ambitions beyond their station. The floor might be packed dirt, or, for the ambitious few, laid with planks scavenged from cart wrecks or distant relatives with better luck. Every crack was stuffed with fabric scraps or straw, toasty, yes, but precisely as flammable as a historical reenactment of poor judgment. And yet, there was something the soddies offered that grander mansions did not. Silence, buried half. Into the land, these homes dulled the wind's cruel gossip into a gentle hush. Snowstorms became whispers. Coyotes yipped in the distance like folk singers rehearsing. The world outside could freeze over, but inside, beneath layers of quilt and sarcasm, families huddled warm. Imagine lying in bed, the thick sod walls pressing the cold away with organic stubbornness, the scent of bread baking in a stove cleverly fashioned from local stone and borrowed optimism, and the muffled storytelling of a father explaining how he wrestled a tumbleweed as big as a horse. A fish story, except with more dust. These homes were not merely shelters. They were statements of fierce, humble resilience. They said, "No, perhaps I don't have bricks, beams, or indoor plumbing, but I do have 2 strong arms, a very sharp spade, and absolutely no plans to freeze today." And so children grew up watching snow form soft caps atop their ceilings, while sparrows nested unintentionally in the roof. Rains might seep in through the soggier bits, but most folks barely minded, grateful for the watery music and the excuse to own a bucket. Even later, when the railroads arrived and lumber once again made its fashionably late entrance to the plains, some households kept their sod homes as root cellars, storage sheds, or stern-looking reminders of hardship embraced with muddy hands. As the stars wheeled silently above those buried dwellings, the whispering grasses of the plains shifted, curling over the decades like a fond memory. The homes, slowly returning to the soil from which they sprung, left hardly a trace, but stories lingered, of cleverness stitched into earthen seams, and warmth not just of body, but of ingenuity. And just over the snowy horizon, something else was stirring. A chapter not in mud this time, but in bricks warmed gently from below. Winds swept across the endless plains, cold winds, sharp as a tailor's needle and twice as sneaky. But underneath those vast, whispering expanses of snow, something astonishing stirred. Coziness. Yes, coziness. Stealthily thriving in sod houses half buried in the earth like shy animals avoiding eye contact with the sky. Let's tiptoe, in woolen socks naturally, into the marvelous minds that decided dirt wasn't just for growing things, it was for living in too. Ah, the infamous soddy. A home made not with dirt, but of it. Imagine arriving as a hopeful settler on the American prairie, gazing out at a landscape flatter than a pancake sitting on a steamroller. Trees, precious few. Stones, as rare as a politician who admits to naps. But there was one thing in abundance: good old thick root-tangled sod, the kind that held together like cake made for giants, a wall-building dream. So they rolled up their sleeves, which were probably scratchy and made of questionable wool, and sliced the ground into bricks, each chunk cut with a tool called a spade, or if you were fancy and wanted to impress your neighbors, a grass saw. Bricks in hand, they stacked them into haphazard rows until a house rose up from the earth like a toad returning to its burrow. The result? A structure as unglamorous as a baked potato, but infinitely warmer in January. And let's not kid ourselves. These homes were no architectural marvels. The walls constantly threatened to eat your bookshelf. Bits of prairie mice occasionally wandered down from the ceiling to say hello. There was the faint scent of damp optimism. But the glory was in the temperature. In the worst of winter, when the wind threw icy tantrums outside, the sod homes nestled into the land like contented soup bowls. The earth, always a few degrees warmer than the air, acted like nature's heated blanket. Living inside a sod home was a bit like hibernating, with chores, livestock, and the occasional existential quandary. Light filtered dimly through tiny windows, or not at all, if you'd had a particularly thrifty week of pain management. The fireplace or stove, often cobbled together from cast-offs or carriage parts, popped and cracked its way through the long season, like a gossiping old uncle just back from the general store. There's something profoundly poetic about those settlers digging into the land, not just agriculturally, but residentially. The prairie, in all its blank indifference, became co-conspirator in survival. And while the cities back east snuggled into red brick homes with satin-gloved door knockers and ambitions of wallpaper, the folk out west were fashioning hobbit holes with a stubbornness inherited straight from the soil. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Many newcomers bristled at the idea of living in the earth. Some complained the ceilings dripped during heavy rains. A few dramatic types insisted they could feel the worms judging them. But for those that stayed, the sod house became a symbol of gritty ingenuity, tied by root and reason to the land on which they staked their lives. Indeed, one woman memorably wrote in her journal that she swept her dirt floor each morning, not because it improved anything, but because it made her feel a little more civilized. Civilization, apparently, is in the details, even if the details are mostly small beetles. Children born in these homes grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to go sledding directly off the roof. And why not? It was half covered in snow anyway. Roofing material in many cases consisted of whatever was within arm's reach. Tar paper, old quilts, or just more sod, thrown with the kind of precise aim one develops after tossing biscuits into a frying pan from across the room. In their clunky, cracking, crumbling way, sod homes worked. They were warm, they were oddly soundproof, and they reminded everyone inside that comfort doesn't always come from elegance. It can also come from knowing you won't freeze during a night that started sometime around November and may not end until tulips lose hope. And soon we'll find ourselves wandering from those earthen hideaways to a different kind of shelter. A structure that invited the elements in just enough to declare a mighty, frosty truce. A home where smoke curled with ceremony and walls told time by the thickness of the frost. But for now, let the sod settle gently around your imagination and dream of cozy quarters stitched together from the very bones of the land. On the silent snowy plains where the wind composed symphonies through the cracks of the world, early American homesteaders were quietly conducting an odyssey of insulation. It was a journey not of grand adventure, but of straw, mud, snowbanks, and pig bladders. Yes, pig bladders, with the occasional wooden spoon thrown in for dramatic tension. While some later generations might have built their dreams on white picket fences and colonial revivals, the settlers of winter-cloaked lands built their dreams quite literally underground, and sometimes slightly to the left of underground, depending on frost patterns. These people weren't just brave. They were pragmatically inventive with a hint of desperate coziness. Take the mysterious allure of the pit house, a name that evokes all the glamour of a forgotten root cellar, but was actually the height of low-rise winter elegance for many early societies. Carved into the earth with an old shovel and a wary eye on the coming snowstorm, these dwellings took advantage of geothermal logic. Dirt, it turns out, doesn't care much for temperature fluctuations. A few feet below the ground, it's a pretty consistent 50-ish degrees Fahrenheit, which, while not quite toast-worthy, was far superior to the 20-degree stampede happening outside. Once you'd hollowed out your subterranean grotto, probably with a friend or equally frozen spouse, you'd assemble a roof of sod, branches, possibly some driftwood if you were near a river and into collecting things, and always a central hearth. This hearth was more than the heart of the home. It was an impromptu weather station, carbon monoxide risk, and marshmallow toasting site all rolled into one. Early pit houses often included a smoke hole, which doubled as the family's entertainment window. Oh look, a cloud. Or is it a buffalo? No, Edward's just making toast again. Of course, not all pit dwellers remained in the pits. Some went just halfway underground, combining dugout enthusiasm with architectural restraint. They built what might politely be called half-buried hybrid cabins. The top half resembled a jaunty woodland cottage. The bottom half suggested someone had given up halfway through digging a grave and said, "Hey, let's call this a library." Meanwhile, in parts of Scandinavia and northern Canada, the ancient Norse trick of turf houses had made the Atlantic voyage. Now picture a hobbit hole, but with fewer waistcoats and more windburn. These sod-roofed homes were masterclasses in thermal conservation. Multiple layers of earth and grass atop the roof created not only stellar insulation, but also a fine habitat for moss, beetles, and occasionally confused goats. One of the lesser acknowledged genius tricks, the double door system. First door. Enter a tiny cold vestibule and close the outer door behind you. Take off your mittens, stomp the snow out of your boots, grumble that you should have traded for better socks last fall. Then, and only then, pass through the inner door into the blessed sanctuary of fire warmth, heavy quilts, and something vaguely resembling soup. Windows, when they weren't entirely ignored as foolish luxuries, were small and covered with translucent stretched animal membrane. Often pig bladder, because glass was expensive, fragile, and frankly a little high maintenance for someone trying not to freeze in their pioneer nightgown. Light came in blurrily, soft and diffused, which sounds romantic until you realize it also made everything inside look like it was permanently underwater. And oh, the beds. Beds were often raised platforms, shared by many, and packed with straw or down, layered generously with animal hides. Not only did this keep bodies elevated away from the chill of the floor, but it also provided an unspoken mutual agreement. If one of us wakes up frozen, we're all rotating sleeping positions tonight. In these modest, hearth-centered universes, winter homes were not just structures against weather. They were snug, smoky capsules of survival, culture, and sheer brilliant stubbornness. In every buried beam and earthen wall was a whispered lullaby of ingenuity, proof that you didn't need central heating, just a shovel, a roof of moss, and a never-ending supply of hot cabbage stew. And as the drifting snow settled over another silent roof, somewhere between ground and sky, prints of something small, perhaps a rabbit, perhaps a chicken seeking higher wages, led off into the soft white distance, where we'll follow, just a little further, into the heart of frontier wintering. As the cold moons of winter drifted silently over the Great Plains, many early settlers figured out something rather brilliant. If you can't fight the earth, you might as well snuggle into it. And so, like particularly resourceful prairie moles, they did just that. They dug in. Today, we descend into the world of sod houses. Those humble half-homes, half-hills, that look like hobbit holes designed by people who definitely had to eat their last chicken. Now, a sod house, or a soddy, wasn't built because someone dreamed of a glamorous life surrounded by roots. No, it was a desperate, brilliant, itchy solution to a major problem. There were no trees, just lots and lots of grass. And underground, the thick, matted earth packed with centuries of roots that made it almost unnaturally good for building walls. Settlers on the prairie faced open skies and endless wind. Think of the kind of wind that could relocate a sheep. Winter storms didn't just knock. You could swear they were attempting to collect rent. With no lumber, and certainly no Home Depot, the only option was to build homes from the very soil beneath their boots. Constructing a sod house wasn't for the faint of heart or the clean of fingernail. The process involved slicing the earth into bricks, each about 2 feet long and 6 inches thick, using a special plow called a grasshopper plow. Once cut, these earthy bricks were stacked like giant brownies until they formed walls. Carefully, patiently, and then with increasing anxiety as the clouds rolled in. The astonishing thing is, they worked. Against all odds and modern architectural instincts, sod houses kept people alive. The thick grass-rooted walls trapped heat. Inside, a basic stove might be fed dried buffalo chips. Not exactly the scent of pine logs, but it burned hot enough to warm a soul. And maybe toast a biscuit, if you didn't breathe too deeply. Rain sometimes leaked through the roof. Occasionally, a snake might vacation in the ceiling. But in the frozen vastness of winter, a well-built soddy was a godsend, or at least an earthy compromise with entropy. And yet, many settlers developed an unexpected attachment to their lumpy earthen homes. They were warm, they were quiet, they muffled the endless howling of the prairie wind, which, left unchecked, could slowly convince a person that the moon was whispering plans to the corn. Now, it's worth noting that these homes were not exactly keen on staying upright forever. After some years, when the sod walls gave in to gravity's suggestions, the house would start shedding bits of ceiling like an old dog losing fur. But even in collapse, the sod house held a kind of poetic dignity. It would simply dissolve back into the land it was borrowed from, as if to say, "Thanks for the time. We had a good run." You might imagine these structures were bleak, but pioneering families, in their usual stubborn optimism, dressed them up. Newspaper glued to walls for both insulation and reading material. Curtains made from flour sacks. And in some high society sod dwellings, a shelf over the stove for the family's one book, one candle, and single teacup that nobody was allowed to actually use. The children who grew up in these houses remembered them with odd fondness. They recalled winter nights when the world shrank down to a circle of warmth around the stove, laughter echoing off mud walls while the storm shrieked like an offended banshee outside. There's something unbeatable about the comfort of being safe inside a haphazard hump of dirt, knowing you dug it yourself. In letters sent back east, people would often gloss over the less idyllic aspects. One gentleman wrote lovingly of his affordable prairie home, carefully omitting the part about the roof growing mushrooms. Another woman, enduring a particularly spirited mouse colony above her bed, simply called prairie life rustic in its charms. Still, the sod house became a symbol of adaptation. It was the embodiment of make-do, not out of choice, but triumph. These homes protected generations through howling blizzards and shifting seasons. Each one stood like a quiet statement. You may take our timber, but you will not take our warmth. And if you do, we'll just dig deeper. And that, nestled between snowdrifts and silent stars, is how a house made of dirt could feel more secure than any mansion of stone. Just ahead, there's a door creaking open to the north woods, where another kind of winter ingenuity awaited. One carved not from the plains, but from forests cloaked in ice and stories, far away from the clamour of cities and the rush of modernity. In landscapes powdered with snow and silence, early settlers huddled inside what might have looked like oversized molehills or very cozy hobbit domiciles gone rogue. But these earthen sanctuaries were not the stuff of fantasy novels. They were practical, homemade thermoses for human life. Among them, one construction stood out like an underappreciated character actor, the half-dug dugout. Now, if you're picturing a hole in the ground with a wooden plank and a prayer, you're not far off. But the dugout, sometimes affectionately called a soddy, or, in less enthusiastic moments, that dirt box where Grandpa lost his boots, was more than crude necessity. It was a clever response to a winter that did not negotiate. Take, for example, the settlers of the Great Plains. Think Kansas, Nebraska, or anywhere west of We Have No Trees County. Trees were scarce, lumber was absurdly expensive, and barns were too valuable for livestock to share. So instead, homesteaders turned to the earth itself. They dug into riverbanks, hillsides, or if flat land was all that was available, directly into the ground, layering thick slabs of sod, grass, roots, and all, over wooden frameworks like earthy lasagna. The insulation, impeccable. Dirt, as it turns out, holds heat with an almost maternal fierceness. An underground, sod-roofed home could stay at a relatively constant temperature, protected from the chills of prairie wind that had perfected the art of flying sideways. Of course, this kind of living came with charming quirks. The floor might be dirt, because flooring was aspirational, and the roof, delightfully alive, could also sprout wildflowers, or, less pleasingly, snakes. Occasionally, someone hanging laundry might return to find a curious badger investigating the chimney. Windows, when present, were small. Glass was a luxury and cold drafts were unwelcome guests. But inside, oh, the warmth. A modest iron stove kept the whole space cozy, albeit with a bit of soot and the occasional need for negotiation when smoke insisted on staying indoors. Walls might be lined with newspapers or flour sacks for added insulation and inspiration. An 1872 article on cholera next to a biscuit recipe makes for diversely educational evenings. It was humble living, but not without its comforts. And families made do, as they always have. There were holiday dinners with more root vegetables than one could name, and yarns spun by candlelight. Children invented games with buttons and imagination, while parents exchanged knowing glances over mugs of something warm enough to excuse the sometimes dripping ceiling. Yes, The dugout roof occasionally leaked, a gentle reminder that nature remained involved with the lease. Still, it was better than the wind-battered tents some arrived in. A dugout stayed put. It braced against the blizzards with quiet resolve, like an old mule or a Midwestern grandmother. There's something deeply endearing about the way settlers could turn stubborn land into shelter. It wasn't glamorous. Martha Stewart wouldn't have approved the color palette, but it worked. And as the snow fell softly outside and the wind howled its lonely howls, families inside their sod homes would listen, dry and warm, sipping tea or something convincingly similar to it. Over time, of course, as settlements grew and trees were felled with gusto, the dugout became a memory, sometimes buried under a new home, sometimes left to collapse gently back into the earth it sprang from. But their legacy sticks around, especially in the words of descendants who recall the time Great Aunt Ruth chased a raccoon out of the chimney with a mop and her good apron. So the next time someone disparages prairie life as dull, feel free to mention that some folks survived winter inside hand-dug holes with mud walls and a roof garden they didn't ask for. Now that's character-building insulation. And as night drapes over the plains and the stars shimmer above with cold indifference, we turn gently from the earthen embrace of the dugout to a place a little more architectural, where bricks, stones, and perhaps even a touch of Scandinavian stubbornness came together to shape the warmest of strongholds. There's a quiet kind of genius in the simple act of not freezing to death. Imagine the wind howling across the open prairie, rattling the bones of every settler who dared build a home where no tree had yet extended a welcome branch. Leaves gone, grass brittle, the geese smarter than humans, already somewhere with mangoes and hammocks. And there you are, far from mangoes, with frost climbing up your eyelashes like it's auditioning for a role in your nightmares. But instead of surrendering to the cold, early settlers turned to a peculiar form of architecture, one that required less carpenter and more mole. They started digging. Enter the soddy, the sod house, or what I like to call the prairie's answer to a hobbit hole. Built quite literally from the ground up, using sod bricks carved from the very earth they slept on. These homes were half beauty, half buried, and entirely brilliant. Sod houses were born of necessity. Timber was hard to find in the grasslands of the Great Plains, but the soil was unreasonably good at holding itself together. Rich root systems from prairie grasses clung to clumps of dirt, like it owed them rent, which meant you could slice the turf into thick, muddy blocks, each one by itself impressively disappointing, but together they formed surprisingly effective walls. Heavy, yes. Waterproof? Almost. Warm? Oh yes. They were insulation miracles. While outside temperatures plunged, the thick sod walls cloaked the home in a primal hug. Inside felt like the earth had decided to spoon you. Walls that were green in summer turned to shaggy brown thatches in winter, sometimes sprouting stubborn shoots indoors if you weren't careful with the sun exposure. A patch of wheat in the bedroom if you left the curtain open too long. Imagine it. A family crouched inside a half-sunken earthen hut, candles flickering, the wind outside trying its best, impression of a rabid banshee, the fire sputtering gently from a stove made of scrap iron or an ambitious pile of stones, and the sod walls, thick and steady, humming like a contented ox. The floor, earth, the ceiling, maybe brushwood, maybe canvas, maybe more sod. But they were protected, grounded quite literally, cozy, in a way that only necessity can produce. Now, sod architecture was not without quirks. Rainy seasons turn walls into thematically inconvenient mudslides. The occasional rodent made a surprise appearance straight from the living wall. Some uninvited mouse guests with zero respect for personal space. And every so often, bugs. Not charming bugs either. Not the polite English ones with monocles, but the many-legged kind who claim squatters' rights in your chimney. Still, it was hard to argue with success. Sod kept heat in, let firewood supplies last longer, and provided a living connection to the land, which was good, considering most sod dwellers were already on first-name terms with the local rocks and roots. But let's go even colder. North of the Great Plains, past the frost line, and into the trailing edge of common sense, there lived groups who'd perfected cold weather architecture thousands of years before it ever occurred to European settlers that frozen eyelashes were not, in fact, a desirable look. The Inuit, in particular, built homes not just with snow, but entirely of snow. You know these homes, of course, the famous igloos. Except, to clarify, igloo in the Inuit languages simply means house. It could be made of stone, turf, or indeed snow. The dome-shaped snow brick variety, that was a specific kind of igloo, built for winter travel or temporary shelter. Constructed with elegantly curved blocks cut from hardened snow, these structures weren't just functional. They were brilliant examples of geometry and thermal physics. The rounded shape left no corners for heat to escape. The entry tunnel plunged below the main room, catching cold air before it could rise inside. Layers of caribou hides lined interior couches, turning a snow cave into something that could, and did, get warm enough to make you sweat. The snow that hurt your face outside became, paradoxically, your refuge, your cozy retreat, your warm snow house. The natural world played cold and cruel, so you trained it to behave with geometry, biology, and a fine eye for snow texture. The early settlers learned these tricks slowly, layering practical knowledge with crossed fingers. Sometimes, someone deep in Dakota territory would look at their muddy cave-like home and mutter, "Well, it ain't Paris, but it's warm," and then tuck another child into an earth-stuffed cot lined with buffalo fur. Even in the absence of modern insulation, drywall, or the minor luxury of not being snowed on inside, the human spirit, armed with shovels, thick mittens, and a flair for not dying, continued to dig, build, and burrow its way toward warmth. As winter deepened and snow emerged victorious in its annual effort to blanket everything, some settlers turned toward even more inventive options: hybrid homes, chimney hacks, and a surprising alliance involving potatoes. But we'll let that secret simmer gently just beneath the frost line of curiosity. As the frosted breath of winter gusted across North America's 18th century prairies, settlers hunkered deeper into the earth, not metaphorically, but quite literally. The landscape might have seemed wide open, endless even, but the real treasures of survival were hidden just below the snow-dusted surface. Here, in this final stretch of the cold season, we find ourselves drifting into the story of earth-bermed homes, sometimes called soddies, or simply dugouts, ingeniously crafted spaces where the line between a good night's sleep and frostbite depended largely on one's ability to think like a mole and build like a badger. You see, when the wind howled like an opinionated aunt no one had asked for, the early settlers' best defense was to vanish below ground. These homes were often nestled into the sides of hills, dug into riverbanks, or even flatly embedded into the earth with grassy mounds plopped neatly atop them like nature's Sherpa hat. The walls were dirt, the roof was sod, and the decor was, shall we say, organic rustic. A visitor stepping into such a dwelling might be greeted by the delightful aroma of damp soil and perhaps the occasional curious beetle. The floor, also dirt. Very trendy now. Back then, it was just the ground. No one worried about sweeping vestibules or matching curtains, but everyone prayed the roof wouldn't collapse mid-stew. Despite their humble appearances, these homes were marvels of passive insulation. With walls sometimes 3 feet thick and roofs packed with layers of earth and grass, temperatures inside remained miraculously stable, even while the outside world groaned. Under a blizzard, the ground acted like a blanket that never got lost in the wash. Fireplaces, often fashioned from stone or dug directly into the wall, added a measure of comfort and a fair amount of soot. Wooden chimneys, yes, wooden, carried smoke upward with remarkable optimism considering their flammable nature. Still, with clever engineering and a bit of luck, many of these homes remained snug havens during months that would make a snowman shiver. Now, while the idea of living underground might sound like something reserved for hobbits or rebellious root vegetables, the average prairie family took great pride in their subterranean sanctuaries. Newspaper accounts from the era reveal an astonishing variety of dugout customization, makeshift shelves, patchwork quilts acting as doors, and in one especially ambitious case, a wall entirely plastered with pages from a Sears catalogue, as if consumerism itself might warm your toes. Livestock, never ones to be left out in the cold, were often invited to share the general vicinity of the earthen abode. Chickens in the corner, a goat under the table, and a young steer named Jeremy, who, according to one cheeky settler's journal, was better conversation than half my cousins. The combination of animal warmth, soil insulation, and limited drafts created an environment that, while earthy in more ways than one, was surprisingly livable. The settlers adapted with humor and resilience. Baking, mending, whittling, and the fine art of not going stir-crazy filled the long nights. Imagine lying in one of these rounded homes, tucked into a straw-stuffed mattress, the walls gently humming with the muffled sounds of wind overhead. A kettle simmers softly, casting plumes of warmth into the dim room. The flicker of a lantern draws lazy shadows that dance among the rough-hewn beams. Outside, the wind may shriek and flail, but here inside, deep in the arms of the earth itself, it feels distantly theatrical, as if the storm were performing for an audience that had politely gone to bed. Even in the biting stillness of winter, life carried on quietly. Bread was baked, stories were told, socks were darned, sometimes again and again, until they resembled more thread than sock. And children, bored and bundled, turned sticks into toy horses and invented games whose rules evolved hourly. It was here, under sod and snow, that settlers practiced the art of patience, the art of hunkering, and unknowingly, the art of sustainable building long before it became fashionable with brochures and buzzwords. Of course, spring would come, thawing the roots, lightening the air, and coaxing life back into the gentle folds of the prairie. But there, wrapped in the warmth of earth and tradition, those early families endured and even thrived without ever needing a thermostat. And so, by candlelight and with muddy boots stacked near the door, we drift onward, just as they once did, toward the edge of winter, toward whatever comes next. As the first silver threads of moonlight stretch across that snow-kissed prairie, let's take one final drowsy stroll through the frosted world of early settlers and their underground dreams. Deep beneath the hush of drifting snowflakes, beneath the crunch of moccasins, or the wheel-grooved hush of sleds, There were little homes snuggled into the earth like wombs of warmth. Sod houses, dugouts, and cellars so humble, they made hobbit holes seem a bit bougie. Imagine waking inside one of these earthen cocoons. The fire's gone to embers, casting a flickering amber across a ceiling made of hand-cut timber and grass-stuffed cracks. The wind chatters and mumbles outside, bumping along the hills like it's gossiping with the fence posts. But inside, a stillness so complete it could almost excuse the occasional drop of melting snow seeping through the turf roof and landing, plip, into your porridge pan. We often picture pioneers as stoic statues wrapped in wool, but in truth, they were just very chilly people with high tolerance for inconveniences. In the dead of winter, early settlers practically became one with their homes, literally. Some dugouts were shallow. You didn't so much enter them as blend into them. Crouching through a doorway so small, it made one consider learning to limbo. Early shelter conditions were dictated less by architecture and more by whatever happened to be lying around. You didn't build a home in the winter. You declared a truce with geography and hoped you had enough sod, sticks, and luck to make it livable. Doors were optional. Windows, hopeful. Indoor plumbing, imaginative. And yet, somehow, in the clay-packed quiet, people managed to read by candlelight, tell stories with steaming cups of chicory, and sleep curled in buffalo robes, dreaming of springtime and possibly fresh-cut lumber. These structures, dugouts in particular, weren't just clever. They were efficient little miracles. Burrowing into a hillside offered natural insulation. The frost couldn't quite creep in, and the livestock couldn't quite creep out. The dugout became a napping fox's daydream, warm, disguised, occasionally hosting the neighbor's goat. Of course, privacy was negotiable. Closely packed quarters gave rise to things like whispered arguments, whispered apologies, and the earliest recorded instance of passive-aggressive knitting. Families grew close, perhaps too close. There are unverified accounts of children developing lifelong stage whispering habits, and the squeak of firewood settling in the night could lead to debates on whether or not raccoons deserved squatters' rights. Still, there's something quietly noble about these homes, so unassuming, so deeply practical. No grand entrances, no pretentious parlors, just packed earth, hard work, and a sincere hope that the storm outside would lose interest. Even their humble imperfections have a certain poetry. The ceiling dripped, yes, but it kept out the wolves. The walls crumbled, yes, but so did pie crusts, and both required tending. Beyond their coziness and creaks, they were monuments to adapting. The settlers worked not against the land, but with it, letting the hills become their roofing partners and the earth itself an ally against the cold. There's a quiet genius in that, a kind of buried brilliance that doesn't shout, but hums drowsily among the roots. And when spring finally wandered back in with muddy boots and a breeze that smelled faintly of optimism, some of these people simply dug deeper, added a barn, or, with great ceremony, installed a floor that wasn't just the earth wearing a hat. Eventually, these homes would evolve or be abandoned. Prairie towns sprang up, railroads whistled in, and wooden houses took root instead. But if you wander off the beaten path, even today, you might stumble across a sunken hole in a hill, half covered in grass and secrets, where the wind still whispers stories from the chimneyless past. So now we settle with them, for just a breath, beneath the soil and snow, nestled in the lungs of the land, where survival once meant sipping tea beside a frost-covered skillet and listening to the long sigh of winter outside. And as the fire in our imagined hearth curls into smoke, puffing gently into drowsy darkness, we leave these homes tucked safely in their earthen blankets. Warm, quiet, forgotten by many, but never by the soil that held them. Now rest. Let your thoughts sway like prairie grass above a buried home. You're safe here, wrapped in whispers, deep in the hush of history's warmest corners. Good night.